and welcome to Dialogue. The U.S Africa Leaders Summit is ongoing in Washington as President Joe Biden hosts 50 delegations from 49 countries plus the African Union. This is the first meeting in 8 years between U.S. and African leaders. What does it say about U.S. policy towards the African continent? How does great power politics, in particular the U.S. competition with China, shape U.S. views toward Africa? And how do African states view the presence of great powers on the continent? To answer these questions and more, I'm glad to be joined today by He Wenping, Senior Research Fellow, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney from East China Normal University, and Baraka Mugabo, multimedia producer of Vision Group Uganda. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. The U.S. restart basically the summit with African countries in 8 years for the first time since 2014. So Wenping, I will start with you. Your research is focusing on Africa, African continent. What are the reasons do you think the U.S. Restarting this session, this summit with African leaders?
Well, basically, I think at least two reasons behind this move. Number one, we all know President Biden used to be the deputy president for the Obama time. They both like Democrats, the party member, and also, the very first U.S. Africa Summit was taking place during Obama's administration. So that was number one, 2014. So now maybe this, the carry on this torch for continue this, attach importance to Africa. This is a very first one. I think the second one, we should consider this big background this year. That is Ukraine, this war between Russia and Ukraine. After this war took place, and then suddenly we see a lot of voting scenario in the UN, in the here and there, a lot of international platform. So given all those voting, those competition, you need to get ticket, right? For the long, long time, Africa continent has been regarded, even from the perspective of Japan. When Japan wants to be this permanent membership in the UN Security Council, they also made this loudly, saying they need to get this voting tickets from Africa continent. You see so many, 54 countries. So I think it is another concern from the White House. Okay, whenever goes on this voting, this issue, they need to unite it. So-called front, there's a united front, and then to constrain, the isolated Russia diplomatically and also in other way around. So this also shows the importance coming from Africa again.
As a voting bloc. Yes, Professor Mahoney, for example, there are many news story carried by the U.S. media saying that the U.S. is basically, and now they are resolved to claw back, for example, as a report in Bloomberg, claw back lost influence. Now the resolve is being tested as the summit is going on. So what do you make of that kind of claim? Like somehow the U.S. influence is lost in Africa?
Well, I think to answer this question, we should address to follow on what Hal Alsher said is, why did Obama do it firstly in 2014? And there were a couple of reasons for that. And this relates to why Biden is doing it now. Again, as she noted, because Biden was his vice president, but there are other things at stake. So if we go back to the Obama time, the United States was already in a period of relative decline. That relative decline really begins to accelerate, some would argue after 9/11, but certainly after the global financial crisis in 2008. But what we saw during Obama's first term was that he was embarrassed by some heavy criticism from African Americans who noted that his predecessor, the white Republican George W. Bush, had done more for Africa than he had. And in fact, he put this summit in place during his second term, and it took place midway through his second term. And at that time, he said the meeting would be recurring, but in fact, it was only held that one time by him. And then, of course, it was never held by his successor, Donald Trump. Now, Trump, as we know, disparaged many African countries and placed travel restrictions. I don't think it's even polite for us to use the language that he used to describe some of those countries on this broadcast. But we know that he not only did not prioritize a positive outreach with Africa, he also had a general policy that is probably best described as strategic disengagement. And I think if there's any solace for Africans, is that he was also vulgar towards European allies. Now, when Obama held the meeting, some countries at that time were excluded, including Zimbabwe. And one of the officials went on to dismiss the meeting as a less than sincere outreach to begin with, and really only a product of America's fear of China's rising influence in Africa, a place that, again, that the United States had not only neglected during Biden's time in office, and you know, with the discount that Bush had done a bit more, but had generally neglected for a very long period of time. So if we find a link to Biden today, and why now, then Biden has really decided to try to compete with China whenever and wherever possible. And so this is, you know, part of his strategic re-engagement after what we saw from the strategic disengagement from Trump.
Part of the strategy against China. Mbarak, you know, you are based in Uganda, and when you look at these the headline stories, for example, clawback lost influence in Africa, or the African countries away from China. What's your response as an African?
The conversation in Africa has always been, and during this time, is how does Africa position itself? Can it as well stand in the correct position of this whole competition, as it has been said? African countries have always demanded that if there is any conversation, it should be of mutual interest, but also focusing so much on addressing the economic challenges of Africa. But the priorities and the foreign policy of the United States of America is entirely being criticized, especially when it comes to Africa. And many of the Africans are not so much optimistic, because they know these presidents and leaders of African countries being called to the United States to just get into the meeting and being told what to do, which in the first place, it should have been a meeting at the African Union, because United States is one party and these are 54 countries.
Professor Mahoney, the White House, you know, when they were talking about the summit, this is summit will build on shared values. And President Biden also talked about, you know, share the vision with African countries. Tell us, what do those terms mean? You know, shared values or value-driven cooperation, or share the vision. Is the vision shared, you know, for African countries? As Mbarak said, they prioritize probably economic growth, development, livelihood. But for the U.S., the priority seems a bit different.
Well, I think generally this is code for democracy and human rights. And, you know, again, we've seen Biden resorting to this type of narrative and trying to divide the world into two camps, what he considers to be more the Democratic camp aligned with the United States, and what he alternatively describes as a non-democratic or totalitarian or authoritative camp aligned with China, Russia, and other countries. But, you know, in fact, not every country invited to the summit. And I think this is the real reason why the summit was held in the U.S. and not in Africa, was because the U.S. wanted to determine who would be allowed to attend. And they could only do that if they held it in the U.S. So, but not every country invited fits the U.S. description of best practices, including the U.S. itself. Now, Biden has said explicitly that he will talk about human rights problems in Africa, that he'll talk about democracy. And I hope African leaders in turn will encourage Biden to do more for human rights in the United States, including for African Americans. But let's be clear, this isn't the democracy summit that Biden held previously, which was something of an embarrassment, nor will it be like his recent trip to the Middle East, which was also something of an embarrassment. My sense is that he'll use a lighter touch to emphasize what he calls shared values, in large measure because American racial sensitivities. If you're not American and you haven't spent a lot of time there, it's really difficult to understand those sensitivities. I think the best description I've seen in sort of a global context is, as someone from the UK said, if you understand class, the sensitivities associated with class in the UK, then you might begin to get a sense of the sensitivities associated with race in the United States. But Biden knows this sensitivity quite well, much better than his predecessor, Trump, of course. And this will, I think, at least I hope, will discourage him from assuming the posture of an elderly white man lecturing Africans on how to behave. Nevertheless, that same culture, and underneath it, the old trope, white man's burden, will reward him in part in domestic politics for this soft paternalism, which is clearly something that he will aim to project, and certainly, I think, associated with American attempts to reestablish hegemony.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wenping, if you look at the priorities, it's interesting to notice that, on one hand, of course, it is important to take care of democracy, freedom, human rights of any particular nation or region. But at the same time, for a lot of developing countries, what's really important, for their people in particular, is about to feed their people and to house their people, to clothe their people. I mean, development is quite important. Probably something developed world often fail to understand how important that is to the people, to the real people.
Yes, exactly. For African countries now, the most concern, the daunting challenge is how to deal with those 3F crises. That's exactly like UN Secretary General Guterres mentioned, like food crisis, fuel crisis, and financial crisis. Yeah, it's called the 3F, those crises. So those are the things related with people's livelihood, like you said, how to feed people, clothe people. But if you talk about all those like democracy, like, all those like equality, but how to make them in the real life, those equality, like those, happiness and democracy cannot be used as a bread to feed people. I think only talking about democracy, that we are not satisfied for all those African leaders travel such far, further away, and then come to the Washington, D.C. So anyhow, they have to put forward some real things. So I heard like U.S. already saying they are going to put forward like $55 billion, saying this is going to be a development assistance, this package for covering the future 3 to 5 years. On the economic issue, trade issue, and the health issue, and also like a security issue. Those some areas has been elaborated. I don't know so far how this kind of money come from where, and in what kind of detail this money will be, to go to those specific projects. Everything remain not that clear. But this number has been put forward, saying $55 billion.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Mahoney, if you take a look at the U.S. Strategy toward Africa, back in August, the U.S. Presented this new strategy calling for reset with in terms of the relationship with Africa. Now, of course, we have this big background here: Ukraine crisis, and also other kinds of crises related to the conflicts, food crisis, the fuel crisis, etc. So that kind of happening somehow provides these conditions for the U.S. to reset or to reshape its relationship with Africa.
Well, on the one hand, the general position of the Biden administration is that all relations needed a reset after Trump. Again, this is abandoning Trump's strategic disengagement for a type of strategic re-engagement. On the other hand, resets were also needed in the wake of the pandemic, which disrupted so much, which has set a lot of countries back, which has imperiled the UN's 2030 development goals. And furthermore, we know that the key document, the key strategy document in the U.S. is the National Security Strategy, which was released this year by Biden, and which, despite the war in Ukraine, despite the manifold problems in the United States that are really the problems of poor governance and political polarization, Biden has fixated on China as the existential threat to U.S. power, and indeed often frames this as a threat to U.S. hegemony. That the United States position globally will not be surpassed by China on his watch, with the assumption that that's what China wants. So again, we see this not just in China but around the world. This desire to compete with China everywhere as part of the national security strategy. Now, in terms of what this really means for Africans and whether or not they'll actually see something of substance from it, I'm not sure. I think that we've seen a number of proposals in different forum, Build Back a Better World, which are very shady. As Holalsher said, we're not really sure where the money's going to come from and where it's really going to go to. And we're not sure who would really have access to it or whether or not it would be allowed to be used for projects that Africans might want to invest in. For example, there may be heavy restrictions associated with American green development initiatives, who knows. But that said, I don't think Biden really cares that much about Africa. Trump certainly didn't. Obama, as the record shows, probably cared less than Bush. So while they have all differed in style, their substantive differences are not that significant. But again, I think if we see any major changes, positive changes that serve Africa well associated with this meeting, then I think we should all embrace them. But we'll have to wait and see.
Well, recently, the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. Said that during an interview, people asked him about, the summit and also the U.S. competition with China. Ambassador Qin Gang said that, China is open basically to cooperation in the African continent for the benefits of Africa instead of geopolitical competition for geopolitical gains. How do you characterize the Chinese policy in general toward Africa?
During the past, no matter what time when Chinese leaders, like foreign minister visited Africa, there's zero time Chinese high-level visiting talking about saying, oh, you have to pay attention to African brother, pay attention to another country, open your eyes widely to see other countries, some this one, that one, their real potential, their real intention, so on and so forth. Never. We often said, this cooperation between China and Africa is open. We welcome. All those other countries, you have very good engagement with Africa. Africa is not anyone's backyard. This is their own yard. African people's their yard. Of course, I also hear a very good African proverb. My African colleagues told me, saying, in my father's house, there are many, many rooms out there. So we can welcome, we can host all kinds of guests in Africa. So no need to take any zero sum, this mentality, saying, China's engagement with Africa, and then there will be some rules for other countries, their engagement with Africa. Actually, no need to worry about that. African continent is a huge continent. So this is China's African policy, open and welcome all the countries together to team up with Africa and then to make Africa development happening. Because Africa also, this is a part of the global society, cannot be some part of the world. You already entered into post-industrial era. Everybody talk about even Wi-Fi, this is also human rights. Whenever I go, I have to be provided with Wi-Fi internet. Otherwise, my human rights has been abused. I even can go to the lawsuit to you. But in African countries, their human rights is the food, the house, clothing, those things. They're also living in this global society. So human rights, I think they are also this is like a sequence way. You have to guarantee the very basic human rights. That is the thing now China wants to do. We're not talking about the shared future of the human, humankind. Humankind is not saying, okay, we just care about our own things. Okay, don't need to care about any others. Because we are also in one of this global society. Yeah, any single country, your own development cannot depend on other countries that are poor. And similarly, like security, also say mutual dependence with each other. So with that, I think China, like a Belt and Road initiative is one, like in the recent 10 years, that is the thing China has been doing now in Africa. Yeah, infrastructure, industrialization, and we have been, we also did lots of summit. Not like the U.S. every 8 years coming up with a second summit. Even since 2015, we have already done 3 times summit.
Yes, of course, there indeed there is an issue of consistency because with the change of the government in Washington, for example, in 2024, if Trump or someone like Trump become the president, probably their African policy will be changed again. So Mubarak, with that being said, I wonder how do Africans look at this? Like whether African countries should be taken for granted or whether they should be seen as, the measure in their own sake, or be seen through this prism of great power competition.
Well, there are 2 narratives, and one, of course, believes that Africa is like a young virgin girl, and there are suitors coming from all places. Those suitors could be sugar daddies somewhere, telling them that I will give you a new dress, or I will buy you a car, or I will get you a new house. So some people look at Africa as it is in a position where it is attracting all these big powers from all over the world. However, as they have been saying, clearly the West, not only US, the entire West, the collective West, has been a little reactionary in Africa, especially when it's seeing a growing presence and a growing participation of other partners, other development partners. Today, China is the biggest development partner with Africa. And certainly, Africans look at this as a kind of everything that the West does, everything that the US does, they look at it from a point of competition, because clearly there has been growing trust issues between Africa and the West. And certainly, this is the perception many of the Africans are now adopting. A perception of saying, yes, we can work with both of them. There is nothing wrong. But the West has paid so much attention in showing Africa that you cannot work with a particular person because of human rights, because of democracy, because of peace. And some these African countries expect that once we go to, for example, to Washington, D.C. to discuss our relations, the discussion should center around Africa and Washington. The discussion to do with China or Russia should take place in Beijing and Moscow, not in Washington. And yes. Most of the Africans believe that the conversation now should be, what can we work on together between Africa and US? And rather than looking at what are you doing with the Chinese and what are you doing with the Russians? I think that's what Africans actually expect out of this kind of interactions.
Professor Mahoney, lastly, as Mubarak mentioned, Washington actually this time around at least is trying very hard officially not to talk much about China, not to put the U.S.-African relationship against the background of competition with China in Africa. So are we going to see real engagement between Washington and African countries, focusing on the development? And then, China and the US and African, Russia, maybe other partners could work together in African continents for the benefits of African nations.
I'm not optimistic that we'll see that at all. As Mr. Magoba was saying, we've seen the US, it may not emphasize this in this meeting, but we've seen the US perpetually raising the specter of China and Africa. We see the false narratives of debt traps, the false narratives of Chinese complicity and corruption and poor governance. And by and large, as he mentioned, these narratives have not rung true in Africa itself, although not all Africans are satisfied with the relations with China or the Chinese who are in Africa. But it's clear that the U.S. is unnerved by China's presence in Africa, a presence which, as has been noted, goes back decades. China has built up businesses, relations, government relations, and all of these things have matured to the point now, which has been noted, that the trade between Africa and China far exceeds that between Africa and the United States. And then, the U.S. has also raised the specter of Russia and Africa, the Warner group, among others. So these are all clearly at the heart of whatever Biden's thinking in terms of his Africa strategy. Now, I think the thing what I really wish some African leaders would do is say to Biden, why don't you get on board with the Global Development Initiative that Beijing has put in place, built into the United Nations, that so many African countries have now signed up for. Why don't all of you work together through a multilateral organization like the United Nations to help us recover from COVID? You didn't do much to help us during the worst days of COVID. We faced all sorts of vaccine diplomacy. We had to rely on China to provide us with many of the things that we needed. So why don't you help us make up for the shortfalls? Not only the historical legacy of appropriating African wealth or neglecting Africa when you were no longer interested, but also the more recent events where you neglected Africa during the global pandemic, which now China is trying to help rectify by supporting things like the GDI to help close those gaps that have expanded due to the pandemic that indicate shortfalls for the 2030 development goals. That would be a marvelous way to frame the conversation and to draw the U.S. into some sort of positive discussion, but we'll see nothing like that, I think, from the American side.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.